Good afternoon. My name is Vikas. In what is my last T4 TV live stream of the year, I'm delighted to bring two incredible leaders from the education sector in South Asia to speak with us. They are my friends, Maimuna Ahmed, who is the founder and CEO of Teach for Bangladesh, and Khadija Bakhtiar, who is also the founder and CEO of Teach for Pakistan. They're part of the Teach for All network, but they run very separate and independent organizations in their countries. And the reason why I'd like to welcome them to this live stream is to give us an understanding about what's been happening in their countries over the last year, because we can often get waylaid by just thinking about where one resides. And so by speaking to leaders such as Khadija and Maimuna, what happens is that we can understand from other contexts. And so welcome to this T4 TV live stream, Khadija and Maimuna. It's a pleasure having you here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, good to be here.
So Khadija, you are the founder and CEO of Teach for Pakistan. Can you tell us in terms of what has Pakistan seen in the education sector as a result of the pandemic in specific? And maybe even before you say that, tell us, just generally speaking, why you set up Teach for Pakistan, as a response to what you were seeing there. It'll be interesting to hear the context and then what's been happening in the last year. If I can, Khadija, if I can just stop you there, I'm going to go to that question from Maimuna until you come back. Everyone has patchy internet, and so Maimuna, I asked you the same question about Bangladesh. Can you elaborate on that for me, please?
Sure. Thanks, Vikas. So I set up Teach for Bangladesh in early 2012, and we began our operations in 2014. And the reason we set up the organization is just seeing the real need for being able to attract quality talent, both into schools as teachers, something you know intimately well is needed around the world, and really being able to develop a pipeline of leaders who care deeply about education and have experienced both the challenges and the joys firsthand to be able to work on bringing the changes that are so sorely needed at a systems level. So that's what we try to do in Teach for Bangladesh through our fellowship program. At the moment, we have about 100 teachers who are working across Bangladesh, working with the most underserved students in mainly government primary schools in Dhaka and in Chittagong. The pandemic has just, of course, disrupted education in Bangladesh hugely, as it has all around the world. Schools have been closed going on 10 months at this point, since March, and have not reopened since. Much of the efforts to keep children learning through the government have been through initiatives to broadcast lessons over television or radio. But by and large, most children, especially because of the technological divide, remain distant from learning and disconnected from schools. So it's been a major disruption. I would say, on the other hand, the pandemic has also had the impact of increasing collaboration among educators, among stakeholders in the education system. So there's a lot more innovation and collaboration happening than we've seen before.
And so it's really interesting. As a believer in collaboration, you know that T4 has done two things over the last week, which is it has publicized that it wants to bring an alliance together of education NGOs and nonprofits as a way of seeding greater collaboration in the not-for-profit and NGO sector. And the second thing was, yesterday we announced that we wanted to recruit country ambassadors to help again build networks and start collaborating and giving ground cover as to what we were doing. And so, as a firm believer in that, what are the types of collaborations that you have seen that have been meaningful in Bangladesh that have helped continuity in education during this period?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's wonderful what you're doing, Vikas, with T4 and creating this alliance of NGOs around the world. I think could be really powerful. At a national level, I've seen this play out in a couple of ways. We've similarly over the last few months kind of seen an organic coalescing of different NGOs and government partners coming together. One of the most significant ones would be a group that's calling themselves ourselves Next Gen Edu, which is just a small group of like-minded innovators and thinkers in education that we meet on a weekly basis. We've been convening spaces with education thought leaders from around the world to come and share what's happening in their contexts, and having policy cafes where people are able to really engage more deeply in the discussion rather than just hearing a one-way flow of information, but then also getting to kind of workshop those ideas and think about how to apply them in their own contexts. So that's been pretty cool. Um, the other level of collaboration I'm seeing, of course, is actually on the ground amongst educators and between educators and community members. I think the most wonderful thing that we've experienced is how the pandemic has really enabled us to come even more close to our communities, to parents, siblings of students, and really understanding how it really does take a village to get a child learning in any context, particularly in such a adverse context as a pandemic.
Do you think, I mean, just following that thread a little bit more, do you think that much can be done as a result of collaboration on a national basis in terms of impact on a national basis? Before you answer that question, I'll bring Khadija back in, whose Wi-Fi is working. So Khadija, welcome back. But Maimuna, if you try to answer that question in terms of, can these collaborative efforts actually have impact? Or is it, forgive me, or is it a matter of people just staying busy and pontificating as to what's possible? How do these collaborators actually break through?
I think it's a great question. I think, to be very honest with you, it's yet to be seen what impact it will really have. I think we're still in the very early stages of this kind of collaboration. I think particularly between government and NGOs. I think in a lot of cases we see NGOs collaborating with one another, but sometimes the challenges come when we're engaging with the public sector and with the mainstream education system. So to be honest, because I think it's yet to be seen. At the same time, I would say that the early indications are all promising. I think we've seen a lot of our friends in the public sector engage with a level of openness and interest in learning and sharing from one another that we haven't seen in the past always.
Well, thank you for that. Khadija, welcome back. Well, hopefully the signal will have improved. Tell us a little bit about your work in Pakistan and what gave rise to you setting up Teach for Pakistan, as well as, what is it that you've seen over the pandemic in the education sector in Pakistan? I'd love to hear that from you.
Thanks, Vikas. I hope that the internet is going to hold steady this time. So really, starting Teach for Pakistan was about seeing a really specific gap. I think there's been a lot of investment in education development in this country in the last 2-3 decades by massive actors and smaller nonprofits and even the private sector. But we haven't really seen the needle shift, particularly when it comes to what are kids learning in school. And how is that being able to change what kind of opportunities they're able to access in life. So Teach for Pakistan was really about saying we've done everything, but we haven't really tried to really solve for creating the kind of people who are going to drive the system forward. And so like change in any system requires it. I think education requires a completely different kind of imagination, vision, and leadership to really transform things. And so that's what Teach for Pakistan exists to do. Maimuna, I'm sure, has already talked a little bit about the work of Teach for Bangladesh. I think we're trying to solve for the same problem in a slightly different context. And in terms of the pandemic, Vikas, what we saw, I think much has been said in the last 9 months, so I won't belabor the many other points. Similar to education systems around the world, I think the one really positive thing that's come out of the pandemic is that suddenly people are talking about the learning gap. Now, this learning gap in a country like Pakistan's, frankly, it's just shed light on an existing problem. We know that in this country, year on year, we're passing kids through grades without making sure that they've mastered the knowledge, skills, behaviors, and habits that they need to have acquired by each grade level. So these learning gaps in many ways are not new. And they do accumulate throughout a child's life journey. It's just that we're now talking about it at a completely different scale and worrying about it. So I think if you ask me what's really happened since the pandemic has hit, in terms of the one positive outcome of it, that's been the change.
And what about, I mean, the world over, there's this, and I ask this question of both of you, the world over, there's this crisis with regards to teacher recruitment and retention, right? So the Teach for All network is famous for trying to recruit the best and the brightest who are not teachers and bring them into teaching, right? And so that's one aspect of it. But what about the teachers that are already in existence in employment in schools around the world? How do we retain them? And are you seeing any effects of the pandemic on that? So in the UK, just as a precursor to you answering that question, there was this survey that was published in the Guardian newspaper, I think, which said that 55% of head teachers, existing head teachers, are looking to leave the sector as a result of the stress of the pandemic. But at the same time, we also have seen an increase in the recruitment of teachers, which has perhaps turned the tide for the government in this country with regards to trying to stem the shortfall that always exists. I'd like to hear that, a little bit more about that from both of you. So I'll go to Khadija first and to Maimuna.
That's so interesting, Vikas, because I think in Pakistan, we've kind of seen a little bit of the opposite happening. And perhaps that's a factor of what kind of challenge the educators who are already in the system are having to face as a result of the pandemic. If I'm completely honest, I don't think that Pakistan has asked much of its educators, particularly its public school educators. They've treated school closures really as a time where schools are off. And not really been involved in the state efforts of, for instance, launching an education channel or broadcasting learning through radio and so on and so forth. So I honestly don't think that it's that they've experienced the same kind of hardship. But also in Pakistan, teaching is a major source of employment, and particularly the public school teacher role is a highly coveted role. And so what we're seeing here right now is we're seeing, for instance, protests happening in Punjab and in Islamabad, where teachers are actually saying regularize us, because that gives them access to certain benefits and different levels of compensation that they don't have when they're just on contract. I will say, though, that does not mean that schools and teachers have had a really hard time of it, particularly when schools reopened. And our expectations on them were to just make sure that the syllabus is covered while all the SOPs are followed, and magically kids are also kind of learning and feeling safe. Those are impossible expectations to put on educators without a lot of support. And so I would say that they've had a hard time of it, but somehow we're not seeing that translate into them wanting to exit the system.
Great. And Maimuna?
Yeah, I would say that the situation is very similar to what Khadija has described in Pakistan, happening in Bangladesh. I don't think retention is necessarily the biggest challenge, especially in the public sector. Once teachers are in, they pretty much have a guaranteed job for life and a steady income, and so are motivated to keep that job. I think that attraction of talent into the system is a challenge. And I don't think that even before the pandemic, we had ways of attracting really high quality candidates or candidates who are really coming from a different mold into the system. And we still don't have it. And I do think that the pandemic has made the profession even less attractive in some ways for that group of potential teachers that we're not even trying to attract to the system.
Oh, wow. And so what I wanted to do was also use this opportunity of speaking with you rather than end it on a very twisted and very hard kind of narrative. What are the stories of courage that you've seen from your countries in the education sector? Khadija, do you want to start with some of the things that you've seen on the ground which have inspired and propelled people into action, perhaps?
I think the most inspiring stories, Vikas, have are all about the stories I've seen of collective leadership. So just seeing how it takes a village to come together to keep kids learning, that's been incredible. And so for me, those examples are, when our teachers have taken the charge and said that we're going to ensure that learning doesn't stop for their group of kids. It has taken enormous efforts from parents in the community, from shopkeepers, from the mosque leader, to make sure that they're getting announcements out to kids about where they can come and pick up learning packs, or what is the number that they can call and get a smartphone through which something is learning content is going to be delivered over WhatsApp, or where is that next class going to be held in what field near the school. So I think that to me is the thing that I find really, really inspiring. And it takes a lot of personal sacrifice, particularly on the part of people who are living and working in low-income communities, to make that possible. And it just tells us what a strong demand there is for education. So I think that's really what I found incredibly inspiring.
Wonderful. And Maimuna, you can't say everything that Khadija said.
I'll share 2 illustrative examples. How about that? When the pandemic started and there was an acute food crisis in the country and many people were out of work overnight, there was a head teacher that we work with who went personally to the local shopkeepers and said to them, here is the list of families in my neighborhood who are in most need. You are not to charge them for rice, lentils, oil, the basics. You are to keep a ledger, and I will personally ensure that you are paid, but you are not to charge them for the next month for these household basics. I think it's an example of the kind of collective leadership that Khadija was talking about. A second example, we have a Teach for Bangladesh teacher in Chittagong, in the port city of Chittagong in Bangladesh, who realized that only about 10 to 15% of his students in his particular neighborhood had access to smartphones of any kind, and the rest did not. And he was really determined to make sure that other children had access so that they could be learning. What he did was he enlisted a group of mothers, the group of mothers who had access to those smartphones, and convinced them to actually spend every week to go out into the community and take their phone and make it available to other households for a few designated hours each week, and thereby just expanding the reach. So it's all of these little micro stories of leadership and communities coming together that I think is getting us through this and will see us through to the other side.
So Maimuna, forgive me for putting you on the spot, but if there was one person you'd like to single out, who would it be? And Khadija, I'm coming to you, so please think of this answer as well. If there was one person, name them. I think it's an important time of year to recognize just the most incredible education change makers in the world. And so in Bangladesh, in your opinion, who would that be?
An inspiring person.
Yeah, someone you think has just knocked it out of the park.
I mean, I would say that first head teacher that I mentioned, Shana Zappa is her name. She's the head teacher of Shohid Tojo Government Primary School in Badda in Bangladesh. Just knocked it out of the park with her just dedication to her families and her community.
Wonderful. Khadija?
This is such a hard one, but I think I'm going to have to name one of our teachers. Her name is Rabia Chaudhry. She's the first person to start, alongside her co-fellow, but she was the first person to start the WhatsApp school in Pakistan that has now just spread like wildfire as an idea, and is being used by educators across the country. But she showed us that it could be done.
Wonderful. So, you are leaders of organizations, right? So you don't necessarily run schools, but nonetheless, you have institutions that you've built. And, the one thing that we all can agree to is the importance of leadership as a subject matter, at least. And the pandemic has, for sure, challenged the leadership of many, many organizations, whether in commerce or whether in the social sector or whether in government. I would love to hear from you in terms of your 3 key leadership lessons that guide the way that you operate. I'm going to start with Maimuna, please. And if you can personalize it by way of telling us who exemplifies that particular lesson for you, that would be useful. But it's not a mandatory thing for this segment of this interview.
Hmm. Yeah, I would say that, the first one, and perhaps this is a bit obvious, is that wellness has to be put in the center. And I would use the example of my colleague, Maliha Fawzia, who leads our program team, and is responsible for all 100 teachers and all the coaches who support them, etc. And I think Maliha is a woman who has demonstrated such incredible powers of listening to her team, really hearing what it is they're needing and going through, and holding space for people to prioritize wellness, because we realized that if that's not taken care of, nothing else
Yeah.
happens. So I think that would be lesson one. Gosh, lesson two, I would say, is just, again, connecting and letting the solutions come from the people closest to the ground. I think that our first instinct, which was a wrong instinct, was to script what the answer should be in response to the pandemic. And we tried to tell our teachers, this is exactly how you should be spending your time now that you're not going to school, et cetera, et cetera. And we had our teachers come back and tell us, no, you don't know what's going on right now. You need to let us actually respond in a way that makes sense, and based on what we're hearing from our students and what we're hearing from our parents. And so that became the second lesson, is to not think that we always have to have the answer in times of uncertainty. We can let the answers emerge from the ground and take lead from our students, and from our teachers. Gosh, the third, and perhaps I can, if you'll allow me, use my own experience, I think, is just to, what the personal lesson I've learned is just to have patience and acceptance that things will feel overwhelming, things will feel out of control at times. And I think a situation like this, a crisis like this, enhances all of our insecurities, all of our doubts, all of our fears. And what I've been really learning through the process is, how do I have patience with myself that too will pass and will emerge on the other side to get some clarity. So I hope that makes sense.
Wonderful. Khadija, what are your three?
I think, Maimuna's were hard to follow. Those are, I think my first one was, I think things move forward when you ground yourselves in real purpose. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, I think in the first round of school closures back in March, when we were completely at a loss for how to move forward, and forget at a loss for how to move forward, but at a loss for how to even gather ourselves and get clear-headed enough to formulate a path forward. I think one of the things that my head of program, Khadija Bakhtiar, said, and then that phrase, we carried it with us through, we have since then, was, what we're trying to fight is not the COVID virus. We're not trying to fight the pandemic. What we're fighting now is what we've always been fighting, which is inequity, and particularly inequity of educational opportunity. And so in a moment like this, that fight becomes even more important. And so we don't know how to do it yet, but that's what we're doing. And so I think that sentiment, that clarity of purpose then has driven what every single decision that we've made since then. And so even when schools did reopen for a brief window, we were not about closing. We were not about trying to get the kids to complete the syllabus. That was not important. What we did was focus on trauma-based teaching and learning, and understanding, diagnosing, testing kids to see what the learning losses were, and focus our efforts very, very surgically on those gaps. But that comes from the clarity of purpose. So I think that's one. The second one, I think, for me, has been about communication, and how critical it is in a time like this, in a time of crisis, to constantly be in touch with people. I remember at one point in the pandemic, I was sending out 2 emails a week to my entire community of staff and fellows. And sometimes those emails would say nothing more than, I'm feeling quite lost right now, and thank you for doing what you're doing, because that's what gives me hope. But I think that communication and the authenticity of that was its power is, I don't think I could have predicted how powerful it would be, because we've come through this so much stronger as a community as a result of that. And I think then the last thing would be, and one of our fellows shared this with me. It was a sermon by Martin Luther King. I don't know, I'm not sure I remember the name right now, but it really talked about the importance of keeping faith and moving forward in what you believe to be the right direction, without looking out for an outcome. So sometimes the outcomes of our efforts may come much later than we'd hoped. But faith is the thing that keeps us moving in that direction, as long as we believe that directionally we are right, and what we're trying to achieve is good. And then, that effort will then resonate with the universe, and at some point down the future, it'll matter. So I think that's what I've kept with me.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And there's been some comments that have come in which I want to read out. And if you're watching this live, you may want to comment and contribute towards this discussion. So we have Neil Pinder saying communication, as you said, is definitely the key. We have a lady called Shahina from Bangladesh who congratulates you. We have someone on Facebook who hasn't done what they were meant to, so that the name shows, says collaborative effort of educators in the system is the only way to sustain education. We've got Paolo from the Center for Education Innovation in New York saying thank you for sharing your experience, and he's offering you any help that he can provide in his capacity. So if you go to LinkedIn and find him, and I'm sure you can reach him, and Paolo, please know that we're thankful to you for doing that. Bushra, who you may know is in Pakistan, talks about, well, obviously thanks both of you for having such a strong leadership role in education in your countries. Kirsten, who is from T4, obviously quotes Maimuna saying letting solutions from the people on the ground is an absolute. And you have other comments, right? For Bushra, for example, she says in terms of leadership, it's such a subject that all of us experience leadership in one way or the other, whether we're receiving it or actually are the leaders. And so Bushra talks about show grace, never stop, and just do it, right? And then Kabiru from Nigeria talks about WhatsApp schools existing, and this has been a great phenomenon that's taken place. And then we have Sonia from Tunisia, who just wanted to say good day to you. And so you have great comments on here. And Bushra is making you an offer, Khadija, saying would love to play my part for Teach for Pakistan. So Bushra, I would say to you, I know you're watching this on Facebook, and so if you could just connect with Khadija either on LinkedIn or email them directly, I'm sure that she would be open to any kind of collaboration, right? And Anita, really valuable experience. Thank you for sharing. And so you have all these very positive lessons. And I thank you on behalf of the global education community for what you do in these countries. And the thing is that it's a very enriching conversation when you provide perspective from the ground, right? And so that's what I'm really thankful to you for. You can often get lost in conversation from a particular region or particular part of the world, but bringing you to a global audience is something that's, I think, fascinating and very rewarding. So thank you so much for participating in this T4 live stream. We're in the run-up to Christmas, and in the West, obviously, it's a big deal. And so you're seeing a natural slowdown, and I too will be taking some days off where I won't be doing any of these antics that I have been doing over the last few weeks. And so thank you once again for taking part. And I wish every single one of you a very Merry Christmas, and I hope you get some rest and relaxation over this time. So thank you, Maimuna. Thank you, Khadija. All power to you for what you do in Pakistan and Bangladesh. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.